Hey everybody, Alan here with another of my world famous mixed emotions videos. This is the Triumph, and the work here at SQ is basically done. I don't have the wheels and tires back on it yet, but that's it. Plan was to take it for a drive tonight, but I am not doing that because in addition to it being about 11 o'clock at night, it is raining really hard outside. Maybe you can hear the rain on the metal roof at the shop. And this car borders on unsafe on its best day, so I figured 11 o'clock at night, pouring rain, that's a little too sketchy for a one-of-a-kind car I just finished. So tonight we'll just walk around, sort of talk you through the work, give you some tips for anybody that's working on a Spitfire yourself, and then we'll take it for a ride and raise some heck tomorrow or whenever the weather clears. Here at the back, not too much to talk about. It's a fairly conventional drum brake type of a setup. Just a couple things I wanted to point out. Spitfires have this transverse monoleaf spring that runs across the back, very similar to vintage Corvettes. Here at SQ, we did these new KYB gas adjust shocks, new drums, all new shoes, hardware, etc. inside, wheel cylinders, and adjusters. A couple things about that. One is whenever you're doing a drum brake job, don't reuse the hardware. Some of the Chilton manuals and so forth say that it's not mandatory, but in my world I would say it is. Two reasons I say that. One is you got to take it all out of there anyway to replace the shoes. And the other is we're talking about $5 on what is probably the most important safety system on the car. So if you're doing the hard part to change the shoes and you've got to strip the springs anyway, do yourself a favor, use new springs. And that's all I'm going to say about that. Now here on the Triumph, the design has, and I should have done this before I put the drums on, but oh well. The design is fairly standard in that it has your wheel cylinder here at the top and then an adjuster at the bottom, which sort of spreads this way in between the shoes, and that gives you your adjustment. Initial adjustment is set via sort of a threaded stud in the back. Has a 1/4-inch square nut on the end of it, and you use a tiny little 1/4-inch wrench to adjust that. When you're doing this, understand or expect that only very small adjustments are going to be necessary. You turn that knob 5 degrees and it's going to be where you need it probably. So don't think you have to really crank on that thing, because you don't. Very, very small adjustments. Here in the front, some things to talk about. Life gets much more interesting. Start with the wheel bearings. More or less a standard assembly. You've got this hub carrier here that's just a big iron hub carrier, and then the brake rotors bolt on from the back. There's 4 bolts with lock washers that run through. You can see these are the studs or the bosses here, and then those bolts run through from the back with a lock washer that mates them to the rotor. That's all fairly standard, but when you do the races on these, do not reuse them. There's a tapered race here on the outside and a bigger one on the inside. There's 2 or 3 different brands of bearings available for these. Timken, SMK, maybe one other British one that I'm not thinking of right off the top of my head. They use a slightly different design, slightly different thickness on the races. If you've got a Timken race already pressed into the hub and your replacement bearings are SMK, you're going to have a mismatch. Take the time, press the races out, use the new ones. Do not reuse the races. But you're probably going to have to take those to somewhere with a press. I bent a stainless steel pick trying to get one of the inner races out of this, and said the heck with it, and just took it to a machine shop, and they hydraulically rammed them out. On the brake calipers themselves, interesting little design. It's a fixed caliper design, dual pistons, one inner, one outer, and it's got these shims here and here that go between the pistons and the brake pads. Do not leave those out, or the pistons will not adjust properly. There's a little arrow on the side of the shim that points the rotation forward. So on these it's pointing up, but you can tell the proper way to orient these anyway, because you see they have these metal clips that come out over the pads. So as long as those clips center properly over the pads, you know you're right. Way to assemble these, you see, can I focus that properly? It's a little hard to see, but there's these pins, one here and one here. Those slide in from the inside, and then there's these little clips right here that you just push straight in, clip those in, hold those pins in. So the way you load it basically is you put the pad into the shim, load those into the caliper, and then slide your pins in and then clip them. Then you pop it over the rotor. I did have to use a bit of a rubber mallet to seat them properly. No big deal. Here on these struts, we did new coilovers on the struts. Again, probably going to have to take that to a hydraulic shop. Why do I say that? You have very little room here between the coils and the A-arms, and also in here in between the coils themselves. I have 3 different strut compressors, but I could not get them right here in the shop, either because the hooks were too deep into the coil and then I couldn't get the shock body loaded, or I had another one that's a McPherson strut compressor that uses more of a block and it's very narrow this way, but when you compressed it down, the coils here were too tight together and you couldn't get it back out. So I had to take these to a shop. Shout out to Louisville Spring. They got those pressed in, but guys, I'm going to give you some feedback on this, and I'm going to throw this out to the rest of you as well. Take a look. It's kind of dark. See if I can get this light in there right. Okay, there we go. These mounting bolts at the top, those are 1/4 inch by 28 fine threads, and they're on these 3 studs that extend from the top of that silver collar that you see on top of the spring. When Louisville Spring pressed those in, they damaged those studs. I had to spend about 2 hours straightening those and cleaning up the threads with a die. So guys, if you're listening, or anybody else out there, be really careful with those studs when you're pressing those springs on. They are surprisingly delicate. Another thing to be careful of is this. Now this is the inner bearing seal. It goes inside the rotor here this way on the spindle with this felt back toward, there's like a stainless insert in this dust shield, and this felt goes over it this way, and then this side goes toward the bearing. There's 2 different designs depending upon the brand of your bearings. This one has a metal piece on the outside, the other one has, it's a black, like a resin composite, I don't know, some kind of compressed felt or rubber or something. But anyway, it's black and much denser, and then it also has the softer felt on the inside. They go this way. Don't do them this way, because this felt will get into the bearings and screw them up. Now, why do I have an extra one of these? Because I'm an idiot, and I'm kidding, but the Chilton manual actually shows this. Can't remember if the Chilton manual shows it this way and the Moss Motors schematic shows it this way, but I could tell right away it wasn't right, because as soon as I mounted it and it got grease into it, this felt started delaminating, and I realized, oh, that's not the right way. This one is an extra because they come in a set of 2, so I have this one left over. Again, don't reuse stuff. You know, this bearing seal, you're talking $2.99 for 2 of them. Cheap insurance. Don't try to cut corners on that because it's just dumb. I don't know if you remember from before, but there was some really hacked up wiring that was sort of draped out here on the car. While we had the suspension apart, we took that in and sort of tucked it in and just cleaned that up a little bit. Final thing we did is the new sway bar ends. They were 42 years old and pretty much rusted solid. They attach via, see that little stud there at the bottom? That just goes into the end of the sway bar. It's sort of a tube with a threaded insert. Then that bolts on the end. And then you've got these counter bolts up here at the top. Again, they're like 15 bucks. Cleans up the handling, and if you've got everything apart, you know, why not make your life easier? Talking about making your life easier, though, this nut here was so rusted before I had to cut them with an angle grinder. That was no fun at all. Final thing we did here at SQ for this car, you remember it had that tiny little round air cleaner on it. In addition to just not flowing enough air, it was very loud. It didn't seal very well here at the bottom. I think it had some gaps in it. You could hear it really sucking for air when the car ran. So instead, SQ did this beautiful Hilborn style scoop, which has actually two elements. If you see here, you've got this metal screen. Behind that, there's like a closed foam pre-filter, and then another screen behind it, and that all bolts together. And then inside the assembly, there's a round K&N element about 3 inches tall. And so you've got very good, very high flow, effective air cleaning. And it really quiets down the intake. That's especially useful on a car like this, where you've got that big scoop sticking out of the hood and you're only about 2 feet away from it when you drive. Put a new battery in it, who cares? I'll connect that tomorrow when we take it for a ride. So anyway, that's the Triumph, and next video we're going to let her rip tater chip and raise some heck, so see you then.